After 7 years of war, Yemen may finally have the chance for peace. A United Nations-led truce appears to be mostly holding. Hello there, I'm Mike Walter, and this is The Heat. It's been described as the forgotten war. Since 2015, a Saudi-led coalition has been fighting with the Houthis for control of Yemen. In April, for the first time since 2016, the United Nations brokered a truce for 2 months. The deal includes fuel imports into held areas, and the return of flights from Sana'a International Airport. So far, flights have not yet resumed. According to the UN, the war has killed tens of thousands of people and caused the world's worst humanitarian crisis. During a recent trip to Sana'a, UN Yemen convoy Hans Grunberg was cautiously optimistic.
This is an opportunity to end the conflict and reach a just peace that meets the legitimate aspirations of the Yemeni people. We have a collective responsibility to rise to the occasion.
For more on Yemen and what comes next, let's bring in our panel here in Washington, D.C. Gerald Feierstein served as the U.S. ambassador to Yemen during the Obama administration. He's currently senior vice president with the Middle East Institute. Also with us, Mohsen Milani is the executive director of the Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies at the University of South Florida. From Los Angeles, Hamoud Salhi is the associate dean of international education and a senior international officer at California State University, Dominguez Hills. And Bahra Shaban is a Yemeni human rights activist. He is joining us from London. And why don't we start there, Bahra? The UN broker deal, it's been in place since early April. So far, it seems to be holding. There's been some reports of violations, but there's also been reports that there's been a decrease in violence. How encouraged are you by these signs? And is this really kind of the last chance at a lasting peace for Yemen?
Well, I don't think there is anything that, as the last chance. There's always an opportunity when such, opportunities arises. Definitely, this is a moment to actually seize, because there is a possibility of brokering a nationwide ceasefire. I would like also to emphasize on the fact that as this has been the first month actually since 2015 that there hasn't been any airstrikes recorded, but that does not mean that there hasn't been civilian casualties. The Houthis have continued to launch attacks on both the cities of Marib in eastern Yemen and also in Taiz in central Yemen. So it is still very early to be, I would say, over optimistic. But also now it depends on the Houthis holding their side of the deal and not to drag the country back into the conflict hole like they did in 2015. So I think in general, I would say I am more optimistic than I was last time I was with you on the show. But of course, there is still a lot of concerns, a lot of worry out there.
Well, you mentioned these two areas where the fighting continues. I mean, how bad is the situation on the ground there?
Well, it's very, very intense and very bad. The city of Taiz has been under siege by the Houthis for almost 5 years now. And the civilians there have been suffering. It is also by UN estimates the worst impacted city in terms of the humanitarian crisis. The Marib has enjoyed a relative stability in the first few years of the conflict. But then as soon as the Houthis started launching attacks and ballistic missiles into the city, there has been an increase in civilian casualties. So it's pretty intense, and it counts on the Houthis. It's holding on this whole agreement. It's counting on the Houthis to act rationally, hopefully for the first time since this conflict begun.
Mohsen, one feature of the truce is commercial flights were set to resume. The first flight was supposed to take off in late April. That didn't happen. We still, as far as I know, are not seeing flights leaving. What's the hang up there, and is that a bit of concern?
Thank you for inviting me, Mike. I appreciate that. Well, I think rather than looking at one aspect of this peace deal, let me look at the broader context of it. The key factor in what is taking place in Yemen is that Saudi Arabia has been unable to defeat the Houthis after 7 years. And now that the Houthis have are in control of at least 70 to 80% of the population in Yemen, both Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates have decided to have this ceasefire with the Houthis. The key element here, and that is one of the reasons why we've had this devastating war for 7 years. The key element is that the Saudis and the Emiratis have to accept the reality that the Houthis have become a formidable force in the Yemeni politics, and it is simply impossible for the Saudis and their allies to eliminate the Houthis. The Houthis, on the other hand, must understand that they cannot single-handedly and alone rule over a diverse country like Yemen. And therefore, while I welcome this truce, this ceasefire, I think I will be waiting to see signals from the Saudis as well as the Emiratis whether they are going to accept the reality on the ground.
And of course, President Hadi stepped down, relinquishing powers to this presidential council on April 7th. How does that change the calculus in your view?
Well, based on what I have heard from the Houthis, the changes are not really that important because the same people who were running the show before are running it. According to one Houthi official, what is taking place in Yemen is a Saudi Emirati plot. You have the same figures, more or less, with the exception of former President Hadi, who was an uncharismatic and ineffective leader. Now they have a council that is much more exclusive. I have to give them credit. The council they have is much more inclusive than the government of Hadi. But again, even there, the Houthis are moving very cautiously, waiting to see whether this is going to be the repetition of what happened in 2015 when former President Salhi was removed from power, and then right after the fall of Sena, whether the removal of Mr. Hadi is going to signal a fundamental change in the way the Saudis and Emiratis are looking at the internal situation in Yemen.
Hamoud, let me ask you that question. Is this going to result in a fundamental change, do you think, in the direction of things?
Not really. I think we have to unpack the Yemeni conflict in three areas. One is you have a serious, deep-rooted conflict domestically, meaning that the issue of distribution of power, the constitutional rights of the Houthis and the minorities, the conflict, the long conflict that exists between the north and the south. These are serious issues that have not been addressed. The second issue that has to be addressed is the conflict or the regional hegemonic sort of struggle or competition between the Iranians and the Saudis. And in the middle there, you have the United Arab Emirates, with the Yemen being trapped as a sphere, as a theater for this fight. So the resolution of the Yemeni conflict has to take into consideration how the regions, both Iran and Saudi Arabia, sees this conflict and whether this protect their national interest. What we've seen lately is that you have a rapprochement with the Turkish, for example, sort of putting their differences with Saudis and the Emiratis and focusing more on the economic side. We have also some serious rapprochement between the Iranians and the United Arab Emirates. These kind of maneuvers are very, very important, and they might lead to certain kind of resolution. And then the third variable, which is very important, is what we emerge from this Ukrainian crisis, the oil revenues or the oil production that the American wants from the Saudis. And that seems to be the Yemeni conflict, the support that Saudis have been asking for the Americans to provide them with offensive weapons and all of that. The same thing with the Emiratis. All of this will also factor in and how the Saudis will use the Ukrainian crisis to their advantage. So far, they have told the Americans, you know, I'll do whatever I want. They have signed a treaty with the Russians. So they seem to be holding to their own powers and maneuvering through the latest change, the presidential change, to strengthen their positions in Yemen. I don't see this as a way out. What we're seeing is basically a temporary sort of maybe a resolution to the ceasefire, maybe some move in one front or another, but long-term or even medium range, we are where we are previously. And if it weren't for the Ukrainian crisis, the Yemeni situation will be on front page, particularly with the humanitarian crisis, with the failure of either of the parties to come to a resolution. And after all, you know, United Nations reports on human rights have stressed that we are on a verge of a humanitarian disaster. So the idea of seeing an agreement there at this point, from my perspective, is still, we are still far away. We can be hopeful, and I'm glad my colleagues there are sort of a little bit optimistic, but we are a long shot from there.
Well, Hamoud, let me ask you about this new council. It's being led by a Yemeni politician who is promising an end to the war. What can you tell us about him and his relationship with Saudi Arabia?
They have good relationship, and Al-Hadi used to have a similar relationship, only to be seen differently. I think what we are looking at the council also has a support of the Yemenis, has a support of the Saudis. I think the idea here is the lack of national unity representative in the council. And the other thing is the legitimacy of the council as perceived by the Yemenis and particularly the Houthis. The continued marginalization and the political level, whether be it for a good reason or on other reasons, the fact is the Houthis have been marginalized, and so other minorities in Saudi Arabia. And the council doesn't seem to be taking that into factor. We're looking more, I guess, from the perspective of the Saudis and the Emiratis, to a body that will continue to be recognized as a political entity that they could work with and they could put some pressure, when in reality the representative of this council is at issue. Now, whether it's practical to have a council that would be representative of all parties is difficult to say. This council could be judged in the final analysis by the outcome it will produce, meaning that what power dynamics that it will introduce to redrawn the distribution of power in the Emirati, in the Yemeni system, and how that will appease or perhaps get the recognition of the diverse groups that exist. This is along ethnic lines, along political lines, but that's where the issue is. So sort of the representation itself is at issue here.
Ambassador Hans Grunberg, the envoy I was talking about earlier, says the truce creates an opening, and that leaders need to capitalize on the unique potential that the truce creates. Are these leaders prepared to do that, do you think?
Well, I think, and it goes back to Bara's comments that opened your segment, it really depends on where the Houthis are. It was clear from the decisions in the Riyadh meetings in April that they were bringing together the parties that would be sitting across the table from the Houthis in any kind of a political negotiation, any kind of a negotiated resolution of the conflict. So what they did is that they lined up all of the other elements, those elements that were loyal to the Houthi government, as well as the Southerners. They brought in the military leadership that would strengthen the ability, if the Houthis decide to go back to armed conflict after this ceasefire expires, that they are positioned in a better sense to either make peace, which would be the preferred outcome, and of course that was what Ambassador Grunberg was referring to, or to take up the military cudgels again if the Houthis decide that they're going to re-engage. We don't know why the Houthis agreed to this 2-month truce. They have in the past agreed when they were in a difficult military situation, which they've been in earlier this year. But their agreement was really in order to buy themselves some time to regroup, re-equip, and prepare for another round of fighting. We don't know whether that's their intention this time, or alternatively, and hopefully, they would have made the decision that they're ready to engage politically.
Ambassador, the U.S., of course, has supplied tens of billions of dollars of bombs, missiles, combat aircraft, attack helicopters to the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates. During the campaign, President Biden said he wanted to slow those funds somewhat and slow the flow of U.S. arms. In his first year in office, though, the administration reportedly sold over $1 billion in arms to the kingdom. But we are hearing reports that there's friction between the United States and Saudi Arabia. What's the relationship like today, and how is that contributing to any of this?
Well, we saw that Bill Burns, the CIA director and a very experienced diplomat, just traveled to Riyadh to meet with Mohammed bin Salman during Ramadan. There have been disagreements between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, most recently over the reaction in response to the Russian aggression against Ukraine, but you know, some of the long-standing tensions. But underlying all of that, the relationship is strong, and I think that the Saudis have been at pains to reiterate that that for them, the U.S. is their key partner. We have had a security relationship with Saudi Arabia really since the end of World War II. That is going to continue. What President Biden was referring to in his comments, of course, was whether the U.S. would be providing offensive weapons that the Saudis would be using in order to sustain their military campaign inside of Yemen. He pledged to slow down on that, but not to change the fundamental basis of the U.S.-Saudi security relationship. And he's maintained that. And of course, what we've seen in the almost year and a half since President Biden took office is that the initial hope was that the change in U.S. policy would encourage the Houthis to come back to the negotiating table, but rather than do that, they doubled down on their military operations, increasing their operations in Marib and in Taz, again, as Buddha referred to, and therefore the context in which President Biden made those comments is no longer really valid.
The war has killed an estimated 377,000 people. They've died as a result of violence, hunger, disease as well. So many children facing malnutrition. We see these pictures. The humanitarian crisis, as we pointed out, very stark. Give us an idea of how the Yemeni people have suffered as a result of this war.
Well, I mean, I think it is without a question that the suffering was, even for me as a Yemeni who lived in Yemen all my life, it was beyond imaginable. I couldn't imagine in my whole life that I would see the images, the country, the people that I know, our cities, my own neighbors, to go through all of that suffering. So I think the Yemeni people in general are very exhausted after 8 years of conflict. But most importantly, I think it is worth mentioning, as the ambassador mentioned, the people who are holding the weapons, who have boots on the ground, are still showing signs that they are capable of regrouping and fighting again. And I think it's also important, Mike, to be careful before using the words like, I've heard you guest saying that the Houthis felt that they were marginalized. This marginalization really came out of their own creation. We were heading towards an election in 2015. The Houthis refused, first of all, to become a political party, and within the Yemeni constitution, they have to become a political party to join the elections. And the second of all, any agreement would actually collapse if any side decides that they don't like the agreement. They can just pick up weapons and start fighting their opponents. This is not how politics should be practiced. The humanitarian crisis is a consequence of the main problem, which is the collapse of the Yemeni state. So the efforts, hopefully this time, would be towards reinstating the institutions that can actually slowly start recovering and start servicing the Yemeni people. And I sincerely hope that this time the voice of reason will come to the people who have been fighting and saying enough is enough. It's time for the Yemenis to slowly build their own economy, start creating jobs, and slowly start rebuilding their lives.
Mohsen, I saw you jotting down some notes. Did you want to jump in here?
Yes, I think, again, it's very important to put what is taking place in context, in historical context. It is true, as your guest just mentioned, that the Houthis refused to become a political party, but there was a reason for it. From 2004, when the Houthis started their insurgency against the Salhi government, until 2011, when the Arab Spring started, they were fighting against the Yemeni government. And then after that, they suspected that if they give away their weapons, then what is going to happen to them is that they're going to be marginalized, and they would have absolutely no leverage to negotiate with the internal powers in Lebanon or with Saudi Arabia. And therefore, they decided not to give their weapons away. So this is a key element. And I agree that the Houthis have committed crimes, atrocities. The various United Nations report from 2015 to 2022 has documented that. I understand that. But that does not mean that others have not tried to marginalize the Houthis. And again, for me, politics is about power, who gets it, how they get it, and how they distribute it.
Okay.
You have to look at this in terms of who is going to be able to govern Yemen. Is that going to be Yemenis, or is it going to be a Yemeni faction with the support from the regional powers?
And Hamoud, let's talk a little bit about that. Iraq has hosted a number of conversations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Are they creating a climate, perhaps, for peace in Yemen?
And that's the challenge. There is the internal dynamics that Dr. Mohsen Milani is talking about, the history that you have there, and then the guest from Yemen as well. These are serious obstacle to the realization of peace. What we've seen so far, all this peace of agreement that, or this ceasefire agreement that you have, or discussion, have always led to a failure, in part because they do not address the real issue, the distribution of power, and addressing the external influence in the resolution of the Yemeni issue. It's as if today the resolution to Yemen it must pass through Iran and Saudi Arabia, and these days more so with and the United States as well. So it's these external factors that are shaping this conflict and making it sort of last for this long. And because the failure of somebody or a group, Houthis or the Saudis or the Emiratis, who could impose a whole set of control of the entire country, including the south and north, the absence of a winner, sadly to say, also makes it all complicated. We are not in a situation that we've seen in Syria or in Algeria in the 1990s, and how these two countries, or in particular Algeria, came out of the civil war. What we've seen in Yemen is a continuance of intervention of external factors, external consideration, and might add now global geopolitical consideration that the conflict in the Ukraine brings onto this area. So it's good that the initiative that the Iraqis led and the Omanis have led before, all of these are good initiatives, but they lack the substance in addressing the real issue of the dynamics of power inside Yemen, and addressing them in such a way that you have a fair and equitable system that would take into account all of those interests.
Ambassador, let me ask you about, we've talked about a lot of regional actors. Let me ask you about Oman. They just successfully helped release a number of foreigners who were held there. They're seen as the Switzerland of the Middle East. What role can they play? I mean, are there back channels? Who's playing in this field right now that could really make a difference, do you think?
Well, certainly the Omanis, who host a Houthi office in Muscat, have played a role. They have been extremely helpful over the years in trying to promote engagement, to provide a platform for the parties to meet and to discuss issues. They undoubtedly would be happy to continue playing that role. Within the GCC, the Kuwaitis also are potentially important actors, perhaps a little bit more within the confidence of the Saudis and the Emiratis. Again, the last time that there was a serious negotiation within the Yemeni context to try to resolve this conflict, it was hosted by the Kuwaitis in 2016. Came very near to completing an agreement at that time. And so Kuwait is also potentially a player here. I would say that within the GCC context, they're the two most likely actors who can provide a bridge.
All right.
I think that we shouldn't overestimate the nature of the negotiations or the discussions that are going on between the Saudis and the Emiratis on one side and the Iranians on the other. I think that they are talking. There's no question about that. But there does not seem, and from what we hear on the Gulf Arab side, there isn't very much expectation that Iran is either ready or willing to play a constructive role in resolving this conflict.
We are going to have to leave it there, Ambassador. Thank you so much. I want to thank all of our guests. That's all the time we have. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. We want to thank you for watching.